but we're operating off of kind of a little bit of a starting point. So talking and focusing on how do we identify dyslexia, and if there is dyslexia, most importantly for our students or our children, how do we intervene so that we can help them make progress and be able to access their education fully at school. This is just a little bit about Morrissey Compton. So we actually are located right here in Redwood City. We were in Palo Alto for 35 years and moved to Redwood City about 5 years ago. Our mission is here, but essentially we were originally known largely as a diagnostic center, which is largely still a lot of what we do. So providing psychological, psychoeducational, neuropsychological assessments, but we also provide intervention services, advocacy, both psychotherapy and educational therapy, and social skills groups and a number of other services. And something that sets us apart and is very important to our mission is that we provide these services to all families in need, regardless of socioeconomic status or financial situation. And we do that through a lot of fundraising and grant writing, but it's an important part of what we do. And we value being part of the Redwood City community. So a little bit just kind of laying out what we're going to talk about today. And it's always important, we're going to leave a lot of time for discussion and questions because we certainly want this to be a conversation. So starting off, we're just going to talk about some red flags in the classroom at different stages. Sometimes it's hard, even for trained educators, to kind of know what struggle is notable to the point where we kind of start to do something or start to wonder. So looking at different red flags, looking at really the science of reading, and I'm going to say reading and spelling because reading and spelling are kind of two sides of the same coin, if you will. But what is it that allows us, especially those of us that have never had any trouble, we maybe aren't sure of why we read and spell fluently, but what actually determines that, and what are the processing and the skills involved in that? What is dyslexia? So we'll look at how it's identified, how it's defined, how is it assessed, how do we know? And then move into the so what. How do we help students with dyslexia or young adults? We also see adults here. And we do see adults, young adults that are being assessed for the first time and didn't know up until this point that they had dyslexia. We'll also look at some assistive technology considerations along with those interventions and accommodations. We live in an exciting time where there are so many technology tools that can make such a difference in granting access to students and adults in their daily life. And then, like I said, leave time for question and answer. So starting out, we can start looking at TK in kindergarten. A lot of times people think isn't this too young to kind of see kind of some concerns or some red flags for dyslexia? It's not, and it's certainly things that we can do to screen and identify perhaps whether we're looking at a full diagnostic picture or not. Kids who are going to need some early intervention and might require kind of some evidence-based instruction to help solidify some skills. And so some of these things that we can see really early on that might be some red flags, things to intervene on and to monitor, difficulty remembering letters of the alphabet. Really early on, the earliest kind of measure of phonological awareness, so that ability to work with sounds and understand how they make language, which is a precursor to being able to decode and read, is at a younger age if you have difficulty with rhyme recognition and production. So in TK in kindergarten, let's say if you're having difficulty, being able to identify, if star and car rhyme, or can you tell me a word that rhymes with bug, right? That potentially can be a red flag, that difficulty understanding and hearing those sounds that they match. Difficulty with sound matching in that same way. if you have difficulty being able to delineate or decide which sounds start with the same sound. And then if we think about looking at print, difficulty recognizing letters, especially once you've had that instruction in TK and kindergarten, if you're really still struggling when you see, an R to know that's an R, despite repetition and explicit teaching of that, that is would be a red flag. And then, maybe not recognizing or being able to write your name in that same way, potentially. So these are real kind of like foundations or basic literacy skills. Of course, we know all kids develop in different ways. Some kids by the end of kindergarten are reading, books on their own. But when we think about red flags, it's really about, where is there a gap or kind of a foundational skill that we're concerned that isn't coming into, isn't becoming part of their foundational skills and isn't starting to be applied with some kind of automaticity, or it's not an automatic skill as they move through kindergarten. And as we move through first and second grade, this is a really interesting time when we look at typical development in reading and written language. There's an incredible amount of growth. And this is why if you look at, a reading level chart or something like that, you'll see that, the expectation is you might grow, 5 or 6 reading levels, 8 reading levels, sometimes within an academic year. And then you can imagine if those previous skills that we discussed hadn't come in by kindergarten, right? You're not going to be ready for this next huge literacy jump. So when we think about some of the red flags in these years, in these first and second grade years, difficulty with inconsistent letter recognition continues to be a red flag. Difficulty with sound symbol correspondence, maybe if we're still struggling to understand, that what sound a P makes, right, at that like single letter sound combination or correspondence, that's a red flag. If we're seeing letter or word reversals when reading, that would be a red flag. And difficulty decoding single words in isolation. So we're talking about, if you're just looking at a CVC word like cat or, bed, things like that, difficulty decoding those words, because that's what that's telling us is you are struggling with, consonant sound recognition, but potentially single vowel sounds. It's also a red flag when we see children who have a very limited sight word vocabulary. If we think about how quick we kind of require that we acquire those high frequency sight words, words like the and those types of words. When we see, students in first or second grade that see the word the and don't recognize it, right? Those types of things, that's a red flag. I also am a big believer that there's a lot we can tell by what kids are telling us. So I think as early as first or second grade, if there's tears or they're telling us it's hard or I can't do it, I think that's a red flag we have to pay attention to. Kids spend a lot of their day in literacy instruction. And so often, sometimes I think, especially as parents, we get what's left over at the end of the day while they've been working hard on that. So I think, the social emotional component or reaction to the act of reading itself can be a red flag. Something that's also notable is letter reversals. A lot of times people say, sometimes, there'll be, parents will ask, oh, my child's reversing letters, should I be worried? And they'll be told, oh, don't worry about it, it's typical. They are typical up until a certain point, or not a huge red flag, but we really shouldn't see, multiple letter reversals. Most people would say past the age of 8 or 9. And so if we continue to see, reversals, that's a red flag, as well as if we see, letter confusion, meaning maybe it's not necessarily a reversal, but you're confusing the letters B, D, P, and Q are very commonly confused because they're the ball and stick letters, they're formed the same. That can be something to start watching as well. If we think about the nature of school, when we move to third grade, and you hear people say this, we're no longer learning to read, we're reading to learn. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind because the nature of instruction changes. And if you are a child that isn't reading, you really are going to be left behind in the general education setting without some kind of support. And so, as we see older students, we see a lot of bright students sometimes who aren't identified as having learning challenges or dyslexia because they sometimes have compensated well up until third or fourth grade. Maybe they have a very strong visual memory. They have memorized a lot of words. They're using a lot of context clues to figure out what's being said and the pictures in the book. But when we get to third grade and beyond, we really can start seeing this because the nature of the reading material changes, where it typically requires some kind of decoding, right? The text itself is not all high frequency words. We see some of those pictures go away, and we start really starting to see, we expect students to be reading going into this fluency stage, right? So being able to read grade level text and read with, intonation, inflection, read with fluency. And so we start to see kids who are really struggling with their fluency and their oral reading is marked by word reading errors. These are kids who often guess at words. So they might, look at it and could might be cloud, kind of see that confusion. They see part of what we call the orthographic structure, certain letter combinations, and like that must be what word it is, right? Which becomes problematic when we start reading things like inference as interest. Those words don't mean the same thing, right? So this heavy reliance on whole word reading leads to a lot of substitution errors, and that sometimes skews comprehension. Often the piece that tells me when I think of how many students I've assessed or looked at samples when I was a teacher as well, I often want to see a student's writing, and that's my first sign to look more at what's going on, because we all don't have to win the spelling bee. But when we think about poor spelling, often in dyslexic learners, what we see is students who are, not spelling in a way that is phonetic, and often are, sometimes you'll also see like a lot of guessing. So they might spell the same word wrong 3 or 4 times in a piece of writing, but 3 or 4 different ways. We also see students who might produce spellings that aren't orthographically sound, meaning they'll put together letter combinations that aren't kind of permitted by the conventions of the English language, right? You might never see those 3 letters together. You might have a word that has no vowels the way they spell it, which if we have a sense or an understanding of the structure of language, we would know we need a vowel in there. So when we think about poor spelling, it's not just, that you're spelling some words incorrectly, but the difficulty with producing, approximations of the target word. We also see in a lot of dyslexic learners as they get older, it's a hallmark of most learning disabilities or developmental disorders of any kind to have relatively weak working memory and auditory working memory challenges. So we often see difficulty remembering dates and names. The acquisition and automaticity of math facts often goes hand in hand with dyslexia. And so people always think, oh, that's interesting. It's a language-based learning disability. Why are memorizing these math facts difficult? We'll talk a little bit more about the processing area related to that. And we often see students also have difficulty acquiring a foreign language, which makes sense if you're having difficulty acquiring or understanding the structure of your your first language, of course, understanding the structure of another language that's phonetically based is also going to be difficult. So to kind of give us a sense, if we talk about if we, I often use the analogy, it's just the way I think of it, of kind of to be a fluent reader and speller and kind of have the foundations for literacy. I often think about, I don't know, a stool, and I think about a stool that had 3 legs. And if one of those legs, isn't tightened or was shorter than the other, right, it would all fall apart. It wouldn't be sturdy and it wouldn't be supportive. And with that kind of metaphor, if you will, these are kind of the 3 table legs or stool legs, the 3 areas that are needed for the foundations for literacy. The first is one that most of us have heard of, phonological awareness, because most of us have heard of our children doing phonics, right? And phonological awareness, or the larger area of phonological processing, is what phonics comes from. And that is essentially, right, instruction in, this is without necessarily phonological awareness. This is without the letters in front of you or any print involved. This has to do with your ability to work with sequences of sounds to make language. And like any skill, phonological awareness is kind of a continuum, and there are basic skills and more advanced skills. And one of the most basic skills we talked about when we're younger is rhyming. But as we move into early elementary school, that ability to isolate a phoneme, like if we said, what is the first sound in the word cat, that ability to realize it's k is going to be important, as well as another kind of basic phonological awareness skill would be the ability to blend. So if we look at that at the syllable level, that might be, if I said popcorn, you would be able to tell me that's the word popcorn. Of course, that becomes more complex if we take a word like cat and we would say at. What word is that? Cat, right? Those kind of foundational or beginning phonological awareness skills should kind of have come in and be pretty solid by the time you're in the early elementary stages. And they need to be for you to be able to then decode or apply those to words in print. And that processing skill that allows us to kind of reflect on and manipulate the sounds of spoken language is orthographic processing. This is the skill that allows us to understand, how do we represent those phonemes or that spoken language within letters, right? Or visual representations, letter patterns. And so orthographic processing is that processing skill that's allowing us to acquire that knowledge, to store it, to retrieve it. Sometimes kids who have pretty significant orthographic processing skills are the ones that really make us scratch our head, because it's a little bit less common to have a severe case of that, and that they're not always as quickly identified, because these are kids who sometimes do kind of spell phonetically, but not correctly. They're having difficulty recalling the visual structure or the orthographic structure of words. And they sometimes omit letters, or to have difficulty recalling the shape of a letter, because that storage of that orthographic representation is impacted. So really, when we think about good literacy instruction, and when you hear about things like the science of reading and the push for good literacy instruction, it really should support both of those processing areas simultaneously. The last area that comes to play with fluent reading, especially, is rapid naming. The reason I have that picture there is that's an example of a rapid naming task, the way we assess this skill. is we just ask someone to name symbolic information. So it can be colors, it can be letters, it could be pictures of everyday items. Essentially, what you're doing is you're looking at the ability to kind of quickly pull out, a verbal label to something that's overly learned, a symbol. And so what we know is weak rapid naming or impaired rapid naming is highly correlated with challenges with reading fluency. Even if we support the phonological awareness and our orthographic processing is strong, if the speed at which we're able to apply those processing skills simultaneously is slow, that's going to impact the speed at which we read, even as those skills come along. And so these are the three areas that probably, if there's anyone here who just is like, I don't know why I can read and spell, it just happened for me, right? Without assessing you, my guess is, right, that these are all really kind of strong or solid skills, and I'm one of those people until I kind of got, into learning everything about dyslexia and teaching this population and really learning all of it. I realized I'm one of those people that kind of just learned it by being in the room. So if we think about what dyslexia is, it is a language-based learning disability, but it's a term that really encaptures a cluster of symptoms, right? So there's this kind of constellation of processing and foundational weaknesses that results in someone having difficulty with reading, spelling, writing. Some people have difficulty with pronouncing words or language itself, but that's not always part of the kind of the puzzle or of the package. And it sometimes can be confusing because different terminology is used interchangeably. Dyslexia is the term I think that we often hear used by those of us that do identify it and provide the intervention, because it helps us understand educationally who the child is and potentially what they need for support. But in a clinical sense, when we diagnose and we use the diagnostic and statistical manual, it's kind of that medical manual, the dyslexia is often coded as, it's an alternative term. We talk about it being a learning disorder or a learning disability. So sometimes people use those terms interchangeably. We're often talking about the same things. And sometimes people are confused by the interchangeable kind of nature of those. Why does dyslexia matter? I think if we think about just how prevalent it is, most statistics now talk about dyslexia. There's a movement of 1 in 5 that we assume, or we recognize that about 20% of the population is believed to have dyslexia. So it is something that is impacting enough, if we just think about the student population, enough of our students that it should get as much attention as any other disorder or any other, occurrence of something that, should get recognition and be addressed in terms of, do we need special curriculum? How do we support kids that need this? So moving into the assessment component, on top of the fact that, I do assessment, so I obviously think it's an important process, but I think it's important when we think about why do assessment? Maybe we see these red flags and we say, okay, they're probably dyslexic. We could jump to the intervention piece, right? Maybe. But I think it's important to talk about what assessment does for us. And so there's kind of different pieces and what I think is so important. For a child that is sitting in a public school and really struggling, school is hard, you are working hard, and we're not seeing reasonable progress. It's important that we talk about reasonable progress, because even if you're responding to some intervention, we need to measure every child's growth against their own present levels, right? we can't always be like, look at their grade level standard if we've just started intervention. But if we look at assessment, the important piece of a school district assessment is only through assessment are you going to qualify for special education. So if your concern is, or you believe, I believe my child needs, intervention pull out with the resource teacher. I'm just using an example. Quite simply, that's not going to happen, right, without an IEP, and you're not going to qualify for an IEP without that request for an assessment. Let's say you have that assessment and you don't qualify for special education necessarily, but there is recognition that some things are challenging for you. Through that assessment, you might also get a 504 plan, which is an accommodation plan. And so in either case, that assessment would be helpful. You also can conduct an assessment through a private clinic, right? Which that's something like we are at Morrissey Compton. And, you, in that same way, you would have a good sense of your child's neuropsychological profile. Through a private assessment, you might also end up with a very clear diagnostic picture. Clinical psychologists are able to diagnose. It's not the role of the school district to diagnose. They can't, right? They're looking at whether or not you qualify for special education, whereas the purpose of a private assessment or a clinical assessment is to understand if there's a diagnostic picture. So there's a different lens. In either case, the big part of assessment that is so helpful is it's really helping you to understand your students' patterns of strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes when a student's struggling, all we see is the weakness, right? We're seeing the struggle, we know that. But through assessment, we really can look at what is the cause of the difficulty. And we also get to see what strengths they have, and we can learn about how to leverage those strengths in the way we teach them and in the way we support them and in the way we teach them strategies. And so there is a lot of, help and a lot of good information through that assessment. And through the assessment, we also get really clear data-driven information about the child's present levels. And what that allows us to do is then set goals for their intervention and understand whatever that intervention is going to be. If this is where they are today, what would be reasonable in a year's time to see where they are? If we don't have that assessment and we don't have that information, we're not really setting up the intervention or the next steps up in a way to be successful. So there's a lot of value to that assessment. And I hope that kind of gives people a good sense of why we might pursue that. A lot of probably my biggest soapbox moment, if I were to stand somewhere and say what's important about assessment, is driving the assessment in a way that is specific for your concern. Meaning, if you're going to request an assessment through the school, through potentially if you're going through a medical model, through your pediatrician, things like that, wherever it is, through a private clinic, is sharing what your concerns are very clearly so that the assessment is designed to investigate all of the areas that are relevant. And for the question of dyslexia, these are the areas I personally think are really important to look at. So an assessment for dyslexia is always going to start with a measure of intellectual functioning or cognitive battery. And the reason that's helpful is that helps us understand kind of what your your intellectual, where we would expect you to function. So these intellectual functioning are looking at skills that you wouldn't necessarily learn in school, but things that you would acquire through your crystallized knowledge, kind of just being out there in the world, how you problem solve, how you use language to explain yourself. How do you see puzzles? Do you understand part to whole or whole to part relationships. Also some memories of some tests that look at memory and speed. All of those things help us understand kind of where your baseline is or where we would expect you to perform. So if we know that, if your IQ is in the average range, we would also expect that your academics would line up with that. We would want to see those areas align. And so through assessment, we also do an academic battery. So you're looking at reading, spelling, writing, and math skills under different kind of conditions. Some of the tests are timed, some of the tests are not timed. Some of the tests look at basic skills like reading word lists. Some of the skills look at applied skills or tests look at applied skills like reading comprehension or written expression, writing a paragraph. So all of those pieces go into the measures of academic achievement. Knowing what we discussed about the areas that are impacted in dyslexic learners and the areas that are needed for foundational literacy or basic literacy, I also advocate strongly that assessments, when we question dyslexia, also specifically look at phonological and orthographic processing. So if we're looking at dyslexia, we would want to see, are there deficits in one or both of those areas? Because we should see deficits there if that's the case. And that information will be really helpful when we look at the intervention component. I also added this last piece. I think it's really important when a student's struggling to also ensure that the difficulties with reading aren't potentially from an intentional challenge, or how is the child feeling about themselves, right? When we know we struggle academically, it can have a social emotional impact. So even if our assessment concern is, just dyslexia or a learning disability, through an assessment, we would at least want to screen and look at attention and social emotional functioning and kind of check in on how those things are looking for that child. There's a lot of words on this slide. So something that I wanted to touch on is sometimes it can be, for parents, it can be a little bit frustrating. They go through the assessment process because sometimes if you get a private assessment, you might find out they do have dyslexia. And it doesn't necessarily always mean that you'll qualify for special education services, right? So something to keep in mind, again, if we go back to dyslexia as a term, we're talking about this constellation of processing and foundational reading and spelling weaknesses that we see that causes some functional limitation on performance. There is a severity scale there, like there is with kind of any neurodevelopmental disorder. Some people are mildly dyslexic. They're dyslexic, right? But it might be that they lack that automaticity of decoding, or they have a slower reading rate, but the other skills look okay. Some people are severely dyslexic. When we talked about those processing areas, if we see someone who has really weak phonological awareness, really poor orthographic processing, and their rapid naming is slow, it's going to be a more severe presentation, right? And so more of those moderate to severe presentations often are those kids that qualify for special education services because it is adversely impacting their educational performance, meaning they cannot access the general education curriculum without specially designed instruction, right? They need different instruction to be able to kind of make progress. Most students that qualify for special education that have dyslexia will qualify under the specific learning disability category. But I would say a large percentage of students that I have assessed that have dyslexia also are served through Section 504 plans in school, which typically does not have services attached, but has a number of accommodations. So it's just an important piece to put up there, is that we can go through the assessment process, understand if there is dyslexia, and then there's this additional component of special education eligibility to walk through. Regardless of whether it's through the school or something that's done privately, there are a number of students with dyslexia that are served through their intervention outside of school because they don't qualify, or the thought is they need a certain methodology that's not currently being used in the school. Some students are doubling up and getting support inside and inside school with the school staff and outside of school. But this is not dyslexia is not new. It's very well researched and we know what works. And so what we know is that for students who are dyslexic and have those deficits in those processing areas, they need multisensory structured language intervention. And that is a mouthful. So what is that? What it is instruction that is explicit and direct. It has a very clear scope and sequence that is developmental as you move through the units of study. The most important piece here is that this instruction simultaneously uses the visual, the auditory, and the kinesthetic learning pathways. The kinesthetic component is the piece that isn't necessarily naturally built into a lot of phonics programs. And it's a really important piece if we think about using that multisensory modality to let the students feel, right? Be able to feel that letter formation, right? And so that's an important piece. Those programs address all of the areas we talked about within the program. It's all encompassing. There's phonemic awareness, orthography, phonics, structural analysis of language, spelling, reading fluency and comprehension. The recommendation is typically for students who are requiring this intervention that it is administered with fidelity, meaning we do it every week with the same amount of time. It's not like a little drop in, like when we have time, we'll work with you. 2 to 3 hours a week. And all I have listed here are just some examples of strong research-based multi-structured language intervention programs that you may have heard of. I understand from the information I was given about Rapid City that there are some teachers within the district that also use Barton, and that is Orton Gillingham influenced, so would have a lot of these components. But those are some examples. I also understand, I was excited to hear that the district is rolling out Lindenwood Bell potentially later this year, which is wonderful. Seeing Stars hits all of these kind of check boxes, if you will, as well. So that's really exciting to hear that within this district that we are seeing some of these MSL programs being used. This is just a little bit about the Orton Gillingham approach. The Orton Gillingham's like an umbrella. There's the Orton Gillingham approach, but then there's Orton Gillingham based approaches. So some of those kind of fall under here, but this is just another example of what it is, because sometimes people are like, how do I know if it is? Something that's also really important is that it's individualized. So if we think about dyslexic learners and bright kids who are going to school, are trying their best, have maybe done a little intervention, more practice, and they're still not reading or spelling, right? We can't drop them into a packaged program and expect them to make progress. They would have already done that. They've been trying all of this time. And so these programs require, right, or this methodology requires that the interventionist be trained in them and that they have that ability to individualize the instruction, right? It's incremental, but we don't move on until they have mastered that piece and that developmental sequence. And so it really, that is why often to effectively use this methodology with children, it's difficult to do, right, in a whole class setting. Is it possible? Yes. There's some schools that I see do it very well. But it often requires some individualization to make sure that they are working through the program in a pace that's allowing them to, demonstrate mastery and in that kind of sequence. The other way that we really help dyslexic learners, so we talked about direct service, but is through accommodations. I've been doing this long enough that I've had the pleasure of now having some students I've tested 3 or 4 times with dyslexia. And sometimes people ask me, what does it look like over time if I have dyslexia? Like, what can I expect? And what's often really neat is for kids and young people who get the early intervention, who get the right instruction, they move from necessarily sometimes needing services and accommodations to just accommodations. So what's really interesting is for a lot of dyslexic learners, they continue in high school and college, even if they're not needing direct service or pull out, to benefit from things like extended time, because they can decode, right? They can sound out words, but it's an effortful process. And if we think about just how much you're expected to read or how long it might take to take a test, it's important they have extended time. Sometimes you can have access to a reader. Again, we live in a great time with technology. So a lot of kids used to be really uncomfortable with the stigma of having something read aloud to them. A lot of times we use technology to do that, and we have our headphones on. So some of that stigma is gone. Something that can be really helpful is adjusting assignments. The reason I use the word adjusted is sometimes people call it modification. It's not a modification because we're not changing the learning objective, and we're not changing what the curriculum area or the learning goal is that we're assessing you on. It's just making an adjustment to the way in which you're able to convey your understanding or that mastery. And so this might look like in math, doing every other problem because it takes you longer. This could look like, we're doing a spelling test where there's, we're learning AR words, right? And it's really difficult for you to spell. Everybody else's test has 10, has 20, we're going to test you on 10, right? We can still show if you got an 80% or a 90% on the test that you have mastery of that spelling test, but the demand on you is less so in terms of that. As you get older, having a note taker can be really helpful. For younger students, sometimes access to a scribe, meaning the teacher sometimes or a teaching assistant will sometimes, like if we think about writer's workshop, I see this with a lot of little kids who are dyslexic. They can't spell at all, but they have so many ideas. So if they're sitting in writer's workshop, they can't write their story because until someone comes over, they can't get their story down. So sometimes even just having them draw the picture and wait till someone can scribe for them can be really helpful. As they get older, there's, great dictation services or supports. A lot of them are just already within the Google Suite, and most kids are using Google Classroom. So that's been an incredible gift that those can be used. Something else that can be really helpful, and I just created this for a new one for a student I was working with, is, there can be, and there's a lot of stuff that's available online for younger kids who are having difficulty spelling, kind of word lists that are commonly used words that are paired with pictures that can help them understand how to spell, and that can kind of help build like a writing bank, if you will, a word bank. So if we know we're doing, writing a story about our field trip to the park, right? We could kind of think about what words we might be using, and you could kind of provide them a bank with some words so that they would know how to spell those. It's also really helpful to have access to books or reading material in e-format and text-to-speech functions. And as I mentioned before, there's a lot of dyslexic learners who have, because of our processing and some working memory challenges, have difficulty with that retrieval of those math facts. So being able to use a 4-function calculator can also be a really helpful accommodation. There's a lot more. These are just common ones that we see. Oh, another one I didn't put on there. I think people don't do this as much anymore. It should be kind of obvious, is not asking a child who has dyslexia to read aloud. And if it is part of an assignment, I mean, there are very real things like we do debates, or we do they still do that? Like walk through the revolution, those different parts where you get up and you're someone. If they're going to have to read out loud, giving them advance notice so they can practice and pre-read with someone to help them, so that they're never asked to cold read something where they might struggle with the fluency or the decoding, and further kind of be embarrassed. So it's also important to just keep that in mind, because it's never anyone's intention, but something as simple as a popcorn read where they know it's coming and I'm next. They can't do it, they're nervous, and they probably are missing the lesson now because they're trying to figure out when it's their turn and pre-read rather than listening to the lesson. So this is just some thoughts on assistive technology. There's so much out there. Years and years ago, this was like my area that I thought I wanted to be all in and study. And so for a long time, this is a lot of years ago now, I'm dating myself, probably like 10 plus years ago, I used to do trainings on assistive technology, and that's all I did. And now it's this huge field that it would literally have to be all that you did to keep up to date. But if we think about dyslexic learners, because there are a lot of different assistive technology tools that are out there that are fantastic if we were talking about other needs, there are a lot of things that are helpful. Text to speech is wonderful, because we certainly want to work on building those reading skills. We want to close that gap. But what do we do in the meantime, right? If you're at a 1st grade reading level in 4th grade, we want to close that gap and get you reading, but we also want you to have access to the history book, right? Or we want you to be able to read the book that all your friends are talking about. If everyone's reading Wings of Fire, I feel like that's popular right now, right? You want to read Wings of Fire too. So these tools in the meantime, it's all about, with assistive technology, it's all about access. And so we can do that through e-text memberships. So if you are dyslexic or you're identified as a student with what they call a print disability, you can have access to Learning Ally and Bookshare, which are, which allow you to have bimodal kind of presentation of text. So you'll hear it and see the print at the same time. And the reason that's better than just listening is there's research that shows that having it, again, multisensory, it's helping us to kind of add new words to that sight word vocabulary. And it helps minimize errors, because if we see the word incorrectly, but we hear it correctly, right, we're going to correct. There's also so many amazing text-to-speech kind of platforms that we can use with everything we do in the Google Suite or in your computer. So that means they have immersive reading features, which means they can read everything to you. They can read the website you're on. They can read the worksheet that your teacher uploaded into Google Classroom. All of a sudden, right, not being able to read that word doesn't keep you from being on par with everyone else. So if we think about granting access, it's really important. In that same way, we have speech to text. So those foundational spelling weaknesses don't get in your way. There's a lot of those out there. So I just put a few in there. Even with Google Voice typing, a lot of people have used Dragon before, even professionally, but there's a lot of dictation services or supports that you can talk into the computer and it types for you. Alleviate the spelling challenges. If you're someone that also has like a dysgraphia, it's another talk, has difficulty with the motor component, that would also help with the speech to text. When we pair that with some note-taking supports, like PDF annotations, there's also the ability to, dictate into your worksheets, for example. So this world of assistive technology is great. I also have some other things listed here. I'm just looking at the time. Within note-taking supports, And then mind mapping, kind of like conceptual and planning software that help more with writing. So these are incredible tools for dyslexic learners. It is definitely something to consider. I would say there should be an assistive technology consideration, consultation, look at the child and say, is it needed? Probably about the time you go in 4th grade, just because of the nature of how complex the text gets so quickly. If you were to take, look at the readability level sometimes in terms of the vocabulary of like a 6th grade, let's say science or social studies book, and we have someone that's not reading multisyllable words, you just can't get to the textbook. So something to consider. And then I just wanted to share some resources. One that I really wanted to make sure you all knew about, maybe you do, but they are my go-to for so many things, and you'll probably see I might be on there. We've done a lot of talks for them. Is Parents Helping Parents. They're wonderful about everything. They have parent support groups, classes, but if nothing else, they have an amazing e-learning library. And when you go on there, it's all free and accessible to you. There are webinars, there are trainings, there's like one-pagers. So even though I know a lot about assistive technology, we are always learning. I had their assistive technology expert come out and train all our staff on assistive technology, and all of that is accessible to you guys, all on their e-learning library. And if you look at things like assistive technology, they even have kits that you can check out to trial things and bring back. So really great resource. And then I just have some other, kind of resources on here. If you want to read more about dyslexia, the International Dyslexia Association has great resources. The Institute for Multisensory Education, ISME, is, kind of the governing body, if you will, or trains, Orton Gillingham instructors and puts out curriculum and resources. If you are trying to find an educational therapist outside of school and you're like, I feel like my child needs intervention, it can be a daunting task. You're not sure where to find someone. So there's an association of educational therapists. There's a number of us from Morrissey Compton that are on there. They can actually help you find someone kind of based on area and some resources. So these are just resources, some there. And then we're here to help. So we're a resource, as you go through journeys, wherever you are in your journey.